Welcome to today's episode of the T on THC, powered by Colorado School of Public Health. Today's guest is Dr. Annie Collier, a psychologist and professor of community and behavioral health at Colorado School of Public Health. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you.
Annie, my first question is really going to be about you. Tell us about your background. I know you're a psychologist, an artist, a professor. Sounds like you've had a diverse career where you lived in places like Alaska and Micronesia. Please give this audience some background.
I'm a clinical psychologist. I trained at UCLA many years ago. My specialty has always been looking at mind-body relationships and considering how health is important. And so my minors were in health psychology. And I really went on a more traditional trajectory in the beginning, looking at working in the area of psycho-oncology. And one of my first jobs was actually here in Colorado as a psychologist that developed psychosocial cancer programs. And then took a jump and went off the beaten path, moved to a small island country in Micronesia called Palau. And there were a lot of very different types of problems, very real problems people were facing there, including substance use and domestic violence. And that really changed. I began to work with communities and develop capacity in people. And the next move was New Zealand. And in New Zealand, I continued working a lot in the area of substance use, particularly working with Maori people who were professionals, getting degrees, supervising them, helping them as they got the training they needed. So both wanderlust, curiosity, and interest in contributing in ways that I had skills wherever I was.
That's wonderful, Annie. Would it be appropriate to say or characterize you as someone who's interested in the health effects of different populations? And if so, say more about that.
Very interested in health disparities and how people can live the healthiest lives they can, but the solutions that we may come up with, let's say here in a big city like Denver, in the average white person may be very, very different than what's needed, what people are interested in, or that could actually work in a lot of different places, including throughout Colorado. So I think that being a trained listener, I always was interested in really trying to hear what people came up with as their solutions and try to help bring what I knew could work to what they valued and what they understood and was important. But I've definitely dealt with health disparity issues, and health equity has been just the crux of my career. Even though that wasn't the path I started on, it just became what I continued to do.
As both an artist and a licensed psychologist, you're pretty unique, I would argue. So tell me about how that has shaped your career, and talk to me about this concept of science-informed art.
Well, they coexisted for many years, my interest in art and my interest in psychology, and it was really early on a choice I had to make to go into the area of psychology. I really wanted to be actually a costumer and a clothing designer, and then I felt like, well, I couldn't do both. So somewhere along the line, I realized, there's a way to combine this. And as a clinical psychologist, I can't call myself an art therapist because that is a different type of degree. But I practice, a lot of my practice will involve bringing art into helping people create and make things. And that really is like a nonverbal, metaphorical way that helps people a lot in terms of coming to better and deeper understandings about what they do. So I have always tried to bring art in. I've actually written a book on using textile arts in therapy with women, and I have incorporated a lot of understanding of my own art making and trying to use symbols that way. And so that's my other ear has always been on for, how can I involve art? So at some point, there was a project I was doing with a graduate student in Arizona. We were talking about the impact, the health and psychological impact of contaminated uranium mines that are all throughout Navajo Nation and the impact that had on people. And we really wanted to bring a voice to people that were experiencing this with the hopes of bringing funding to them so that they could get help. And conversations just kept flowing, and it ended up, we came up with the idea that, well, we're going to do art therapy to try to help them as we do these interviews with them. at some point it was like, why don't we do an exhibition? And that's actually where I met John Tanus, who is the co-director of the exhibition we're doing now on high concentration cannabis, and another artist who curated the show. We ended up coming together and deciding, yeah, let's use art as a medium and let the community tell their stories. And I had no idea what kind of powerful impact it would have, both on the artists as well as on the people who came to see the exhibit. Mind you, I also had been doing research on art making for many years, on the individual and the impact that has and how it benefits the individual. So this was like also a new leap for me to think about, how can we use art in a way that benefits the community, and how can we understand that from a research perspective? Like, how can artists create pieces, if they're more personally meaningful, will that be more meaningful for the community? So I've started doing research in that area also to try to understand how can we maximize this.
And we are working on a project about cannabis. So please talk to me about your role in that project, the role of Colorado School of Public Health, and then let's tie it back to art.
Sure. When I first interviewed for the position, I decided, well, I'm interested in art, and that sounds kind of wacky, but I'm not going to hide that. So as part of my interview, I actually told them about the work that I had done on Navajo Nation. And they became more and more interested in it. And they knew that they had actually been hearing from community members throughout Colorado that they thought one way to bring this information was through art pop-ups and through art and using the arts. So it was actually a really interesting fit. So when I first came and began work here, I was very interested in the health education campaign, but they gave me support from the very beginning to use art as a medium and do an art exhibition on the topic.
So as we move from your interest in art and how that's affecting your work at Colorado School of Public Health, let's talk more broadly about all the elements of the work you're doing in cannabis. So do you mind letting our viewers understand the full capacity of your work?
Sure. So again, the themes right now that the health education campaign is focused on is youth, young adults, and people who are pregnant, because we know that there's research on the impact of cannabis on people who are young in their developing brains, as well as on fetuses and their development. So the art is really only one component of what we're doing, still trying to focus on those populations. We have work that's going on both to empower community members to have difficult conversations about cannabis with people that are loved ones, with people they work with people in schools. We're working with different groups throughout the state to try to develop educational forums on coping techniques and different types of coping techniques. We're continuing to hold community engaged meetings to understand what the types of messages people would like to have delivered and how they would be delivered. We're looking at partnering with different universities in Colorado to understand how to market as well as provide information to college students and people in that age range that would be interested. So there's a lot of different components. We actually have 8 different projects that we're doing. The art is only one of them.
Wonderful. And this all spun out of legislation, right? Can you speak to that?
Well, the legislation really empowered the University of Colorado to understand scientifically what is known about high concentration cannabis. And from that information, we were directed with creating an educational campaign that would then translate that information into different types of messages for people across Colorado. And so I'm the director of the health education campaign and continually trying to understand how we would bring these messages forward. And so working with your firm is one of them.
Wonderful. Yeah. And talk to me about what you highlighted. You talked about coping mechanisms. So can you unpack what even the definition of coping mechanisms is and how cannabis and other things are used as coping mechanisms?
Sure. I'm going to take one step back and just tell you that one of the things that came out of the community engagement meetings was that people didn't want to be told what not to do. They wanted to get ideas about what they could do instead. And even though it may seem obvious that there's a lot of things that people can try besides using cannabis, people really weren't sure. A lot of people really weren't sure what alternatives were. And so that then became an underlying part of our campaign was to try to bring ideas from positive psychology into the mix and try to emphasize that there's other choices you could make besides cannabis. So we're not really trying to say, don't do cannabis. We're trying to say, here are other ideas of what you could do.
As a psychologist, say a little bit more about this kind of coping mechanism concept.
So coping is basically something that can describe what we do when we're faced with stress, with difficult times, with negative emotions. And there can be things we do that are constructive and things we do that are not constructive. Positive, constructive things would be going out in nature, going on walks, would be meditating, would be trying to get different perspectives on things. It might be spending time with friends. These would be things that maybe we do automatically, but also sometimes we would be thinking, I had a terrible day today and I need to go do something that will make me feel better. We can also do things at times that aren't as helpful, such as using too much alcohol, such as using food as a way to, even though, I will definitely be one that will have a nice big ice cream when I've had a bad day. But if you're doing that all the time, and you're doing things that aren't necessarily good for your body, it can become destructive. That would be more negative coping. And I think there's a lot of things that we do when done to excess that could be a problem that are not a problem in this short term.
And is the research illustrating that cannabis use as a coping mechanism is on the rise?
I'm not sure that there has been research on that. So I think that's a good question, is whether we see whether use as a coping mechanism is on a rise. I think that interestingly, I know this about alcohol. Cultures that have had alcohol available to them for longer actually have more positive and constructive ways of using it. So there's community safeguards around that. So think about European communities drinking alcohol. People can drink a lot at a meal, and it doesn't mean they have an alcohol problem, but people have an understanding and guardrails around it. So, but in cultures and countries where alcohol may be newer, it can be used more destructively.
We do have a special concern for pregnant people and youth. So speak about those two groups and the concerns we have around cannabis use for them.
So cannabis use, even if we're not talking about high concentration cannabis, we know that cannabis use can potentially interfere with brain development in ways that we're only just beginning to understand how. But it is associated with more difficulties with mental health, with psychosis, with what we call schizophrenia, and other types of mental health disorders. It seems like you are using it at a younger age, it can cause more damage as you're developing. And up until the brain is developed at age 25. And why they came up with 25, because that is generally when people are fully developed. There's other things that it can do as well to lung problems. And the people who are pregnant, while it may or may not cause damage to the parent, the person who's pregnant, it potentially will do just as much damage to the fetus in terms of development. What most of the researchers at University of Colorado have concluded is that higher concentrations are probably associated with more damage and more long-term risks for people that we already know have problems with lower levels of cannabis.
Annie, our viewers are interested in the T. We want the T on THC. And I've heard you say that sometimes cannabis use can be used in excess and can become a negative coping mechanism. Talk to me about some alternative positive coping mechanisms.
I think there's a lot just out our doorstep in Colorado. We have so much outdoor opportunities. Outdoor opportunities with other people can be actually really, really important. So social support is actually one of the types of positive ways that we can cope with problems. We also like to talk about meditation, physical activity. Any kind of physical activity is really, really important. So you've got nature, but you also have physical activity. Let's see, what are other things that are constructive? Humor, playfulness, changing your mindset and your perspective. So we talk about mindfulness, but there's a lot to unpack in mindfulness, including ways that you're perceiving situations that could be looking at something as a growth opportunity.
Is there any specific guidance for youth versus pregnant moms, or are they kind of general themes?
I would say that what's important is that it's good to have several different kinds of ways to cope. So the more ways you have to cope with problems and difficulties, probably the better you will be. You have more to rely on because sometimes the outdoors are not available to you. So if you've learned how to do deep breathing and slow breathing, that can actually help you when you've got like only about a minute to try to decompress in a situation. So I would say being interested and being curious about other things you could do besides relying on substances would be really important. I've heard from a lot of people that using cannabis is a really, really powerful and quick fix for anxiety and for feeling uncomfortable and negative emotions, which means it can be even harder to step away from that and try something else when you've got something you know is a quick fix. But I would just encourage people to try to think about what do you want in the long run in your life, and is the cannabis going to serve you to get to where you want? And are there other things that you might try and learn to use that would be healthier for you in the long run?
So basically, have a lot of tools in your toolkit, if you will, and we will be illustrating some of these types of coping mechanisms on the website, the T on THC. So thank you for that. So in addition to what you spoke about in coping mechanism, clearly art can be a coping mechanism, it would seem. So maybe speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about art making as a coping mechanism. One thing that I've actually looked at in my own research is we often think that to cope you need to calm yourself down, and that's where meditation and relaxation comes in. But I actually, in my own life, as well as in talking to a lot of people as a psychologist, people often find that bringing their energy up can also help them to cope with problems. And that could be through physical activity and art making, for example, because art making is not necessarily calming. It can be really exciting and exhilarating. And so I want to just also emphasize that you can find more active things to do in order to help shift your mind away from your problems or to get a different perspective. It doesn't just have to be relaxation, because that doesn't really work for me that well. I'm more somebody who wants to go kind of get more stimulation and do something, and that's where the art making works for me as well as for a lot of people.
Annie, I often tell the story of having to talk to my son about cannabis at 10. We are in an era where it's ubiquitous in Colorado, the smells, the scents, the signs of it. And at a baseball park the other day, my son saw the little no symbol on top of a leaf. It was a marijuana leaf. And he said, Dad, I know what that is, no smoking, but what is that? No marijuana. And I was in the moment where I had to have the conversation. So what's your suggestion for parents in the predicament that I was in? And that's an increasing reality in Colorado and across the nation.
Well, I think that to have those conversations are critical. I think to try to just, brush it off makes it more mysterious and more problematic. So I think just being factual, thinking about the age that they're at and what they can understand. And often, I think one of the most important guides for parents is answering questions, but not excessively. So answer their questions, let them know they can bring it up at other times, as well as encourage them to talk to you about it. I think trying to keep the doors open on a variety of topics is a really important part of parenting, because it's going to come up again. If you're too judgmental or you impart something that may be different than what their peer group is experiencing or what they may be experiencing, you're going to shut down that conversation.
Yeah. And our children increasingly get mixed messages. They get messages in the schools. They get messages from the peer groups, as you mentioned. And then they try to get messages from the parents. So what happens when the kids aren't receptive to the message that when you're providing?
Well, that's going to happen. I think persistence is the key thing. Being willing to have those conversations, not taking their responses at face values, asking them questions about it. I've had parents ask me, do I share that I've used it or that I don't use it? And people come in different areas with that. I mean, they really fall differently. Some people are open with their kids. Later on, they've told me they regretted that because it made it like they were social modeling for their kids to use it. The other side of it is kids are going to tell if you're being fake or insincere. And so I think being just honest with them about your perspective, but being open to their perspective. Because let's say you're not using it and you don't believe they should use it, that may turn them off from having that conversation. So keeping an open mind with them, I think, is critical. And not letting the conversation end with the first time you have that conversation.
Thank you. That's great clinical guidance in some respects, but talk to me on a personal level. You're a mother as well. Are there any personal narratives where this theory kind of resonated in the practice of raising a child?
Yeah, so of course, like any parent, I didn't think my kids were going to do drugs or did drugs because we had this open communication going on. So I remember one time when they were starting to drive, 15, 16 years old, going out with their friends. One of my kids actually was going and hanging out in a place that was a park kind of up in the mountains. And I'm like, what are you doing there? And, she said, nothing, we're just hanging out. It's really pretty. And then I'm like, so are there drugs there? And she was like, no, there's no drugs. We're not doing drugs. My friends wouldn't do that. And if they did, I wouldn't do them. And I was like, okay, do I take her at face value? And then the next time that happened, and I could actually see where she was, brought it up again and again. And then not in a punitive way of getting mad at her, but really trying to talk about, okay, well, what does it mean if you're with kids that are getting high in terms of who's driving and in terms of who's being responsible? What does it mean if you had police come there? And what does it mean for what you want to do? And is it okay to do that? In what setting would it be better to do that? So just trying to continue the conversation, like, I know you told me nothing was going on, but being persistent and also trying to ask questions and encourage them to think about the ramifications of their actions, kept the door open. And now it's like we joke about it, like, you picked up on it. And I followed that mother's intuition a lot, and it was a good thing. So, she's like, well, I picked up on it, and, it made it easier to talk to you about it.
And again, we do have guidance for our listeners on the T on THC, and these personal stories of something that many parents across the country are challenged with is really helpful. So Annie, you talk about this concept of persistence in terms of getting to the core of the issue with kids on topics such as cannabis use and beyond. Are there other theories that kind of shape this kind of concept of persistence or approaches that you would advocate parents use?
Drawing on ideas from psychology and from motivational interviewing, there's this idea of asking questions and making sure that you ask questions that are open-ended. Because what you want to do is keep the conversation going. And a lot of times through people talking, they come up with solutions or their own ideas about it. But I think we don't always do a good enough job of really listening when people are talking. So asking open-ended questions. So instead of saying, are you hungry? Yes or no. What kind of food would you feel like eating? That's an example of an open-ended question around food. But then really listening to what somebody's saying and starting to reflect back what they're saying, and holding on to your own experience and holding back your own judgment of their experience, trying to keep an open mind and encourage the conversation to keep going. So that's a part of the idea is where I say persistence, it's not letting the discomfort, the awkwardness that either of you are feeling, shut the conversation down, but then trying to approach it with continuing a discussion, asking questions, trying to help them understand what their purposes are, their goals are, and what they want for themselves so that they understand their actions and the consequences of their actions.
And motivational interviewing is kind of a unique term, Annie, and kind of not a popular term in parenting.
Right.
But is it that you're getting to the core issue of asking questions in a way that are motivating people to come up with the answers on their own?
Exactly, yeah. So I just basically like to talk about it as how do you have difficult conversations? But it is asking questions so the dialogue can continue and you can really encourage people to think about what they have to try and to deal with the situation or what they need in order to deal with the situation, instead of giving them the answers and telling them what to do.
Yeah, that really resonates with the campaign. The T on THC seeks to provide just the facts and that people take those facts and then use those facts in a way that they can go forth with. So thank you for unpacking motivational interviewing. I've heard the term a lot, I've used it a lot, but I think I understand it better now.
And that was a really simple definition of it. But yeah, it's more getting conversations going and trying to then help people understand what they're saying and come up with the answers themselves or help them get the information they need in order to come up with the answers.
And one final question on that. So that makes sense to me from a psychological standpoint, because a psychologist, if you think of armchair psychologists, are often talking and talk therapy. So can you locate that a little bit, the motivational interviewing and the concept of psychology a bit more?
Well, I think that people's myth about psychology is you see a therapist and they tell you what to do, and they're going to fix a problem for you. But really, the best work that come out of that is for you to have insight into what you're thinking and what you need. And maybe that person could be there as a sounding board to reflect back to you what you're saying. But a lot of the work is done by you, and it comes out of a lot of psychology's ways of asking open-ended questions, being reflective and listening. In fact, we know that reflective listening is much better than telling somebody what to do or making interpretations. It's better to let people think through the problem on their own.
Annie, as we come to the close of this episode, I want to return to art for a moment. Later today, we will both be at a groundbreaking art exhibit called Hearsay, where they explore the effects of high concentration cannabis. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of such an exhibit and your aspirations for the exhibit tonight and beyond?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I really think that we're onto something where using science to really educate artists on an issue is really important. And I know a lot of artists will take that on themselves, where they will do research when they're developing something new, but really trying to bring people together on a topic and then fully educating them experientially, scientifically, social justice perspectives on it, the ethics of different issues. This really makes the art that they produce a lot richer. My hope for this exhibition is that it sparks a dialogue and that it gets people thinking a little bit critically, or opens the door a tiny bit to have discussions with kids or with families or with themselves about what they're using and what it means. We don't really want to hit people over the head with something and turn them off. We want them to just think about it. So just like I brought up that example with just trying to ask my daughter questions, I want people to walk away from tonight going, that's interesting. So they don't really know what high concentration cannabis research says, but cannabis may be causing problems. I didn't know that. People could walk away knowing the difference between THC and CBD. So I want people to leave this challenged by thinking about something new. I'd like the art community to think about different ways that they can use art in terms of having an impact on the community. And I think I want it to be fun. I think I want it to be an interesting, fun, novel way to talk about these issues.
Well, I look forward to a fun evening today. I look forward to having you back in future episodes to talk about science-informed art and the benefits of this campaign at large. Annie Collier, professor, licensed psychologist, mother, and artist, thank you for your time today. We covered a wide range of topics, including science-informed art, coping mechanisms, and the value of having conversations with your children on sensitive topics. Annie, thank you.
Thank you.